Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast. Glad to have you with us. Ready for another deep dive? This time it's something hotter than you might think, even though it's used to measure temperature. Today we're exploring the world as thermometers.
Oh yeah, a tool we see every day but don't really think twice about. But trust me, there's a whole lot more to them than meets the eye.
It really is fascinating. I mean, we use them constantly, but have you ever actually stopped to think, like, what even is temperature? How did we go from feeling hot or cold to actually measuring it?
It's a journey that goes way back, long before the thermometers we know today. It all started with observation, people noticing the world around them.
Okay, so back to basics.
Pretty much. Think ancient world, even before formal science. We're talking about thinkers like Philo of Byzantium, a Greek scholar, 3rd century BC.
So what did he do? Invent the first thermometer?
Not quite, but he was on the right track. He did this experiment with a hollow sphere, a tube, and some water. When he heated the sphere, air inside expanded and pushed the water down. Let it cool, the air contracted, water went back up. Simple, but genius.
So he was basically showing that heat makes air expand, kind of like a very early understanding of thermal expansion.
Exactly, and using totally basic stuff, centuries before we had physics as a science.
It's like a science fair project, but way ahead of its time.
Right, it shows how these ancient thinkers were already figuring out how the world worked. And then a few centuries later, you've got hero Alexandria. Building on Philo's work, he actually created a fountain powered by the sun.
Wait, a solar-powered fountain? Back then, how?
It used the sun's heat to expand air in a closed system. That air pressure put the water, creating the fountain.
Wow, pretty ingenious. So we're seeing how people started liking heat and air expansion, even using it to build stuff. But still a long way from the thermometers we have, right?
Right. It takes another big step with Galen, a Greek physician, 2nd century AD. He was in Rome. He started thinking about temperature in terms of degrees, not just hot or cold, but degrees of hot and cold.
So he was thinking about measuring temperature in a more specific way.
Exactly. He even suggested using a mix of ice and boiling water as a reference point. Sound familiar?
That's like the basis for how we measure temperature today.
Exactly. Galen was way ahead. His ideas were the foundation for everything that came after.
Really makes you appreciate those early scientists figuring all this out without the tools we have today.
They were true pioneers, setting the stage for our understanding of temperature.
Absolutely. And speaking of journeys, before we go any further, I want to remind our listeners to hit that subscribe button. That way you won't miss out on any more fascinating deep dives here on Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast.
So yeah, we've got the groundbreaking ideas from Galen, but then things kind of stalled for a while.
It's like that with a lot of big discoveries. Takes a while to catch on.
Right, like planting a seed. Needs the right time to sprout.
I like that analogy. So when did those seeds finally start growing when it comes to thermometers?
Well, fast forward to the late 1500s, early 1600s, that's when the thermoscope pops up.
The thermoscope, I remember reading about that. What was it exactly?
Think of it as like a proto-thermometer. It could show changes in temperature, but didn't have a standardized scale. Scientists like Galileo were working with these.
So you could see if something was getting hotter or colder, but not by how much.
Exactly. Good start, but not very precise, for science and stuff. And then finally, in the 1600s, that's when we first see the word thermometer, from the Greek words for hot and measure.
So that's the big difference, the scale. The thermoscope shows change. The thermometer actually measures it.
Exactly. Adding that scale was a huge leap, made it a real measuring tool. But even then, there was no standard way to measure. Everyone was using their own system.
Wow, that must have been confusing, like trying to speak different languages.
Totally. Scientists couldn't easily compare their results. It was a mess.
So who came along and fixed it?
Well, that's where our temperature heroes come in, Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit and Anders Celsius. They didn't just invent thermometers, they created the standardized scales we use today.
Fahrenheit and Celsius now, those are names everyone knows. But we don't usually think about how much they change things.
It was revolutionary. They gave us a common language for temperature, made it possible to share and compare measurements accurately. Think about medicine or weather forecasting.
It's true, we take those things for granted. But they wouldn't be possible without standardized temperature scales.
Exactly. Their work was a game changer. And the story doesn't stop there. I mean, sure, we got the scales, but thermometers kept evolving. All kinds of different designs and uses.
There's more. So what happened next in the world of thermometers?
Scientists started realizing there were different ways to approach measuring temperature. This led to primary and secondary thermometers.
Okay, primary and secondary. I'm not familiar with that. What's the difference?
Primary thermometers are like the ultimate standard. They're super precise, but also complicated, not for everyday use. They use fundamental physical properties to measure temperature directly.
So they're like the official timekeepers of temperature.
Yeah, you could say that. And then secondary thermometers are calibrated against those primary ones. They're more practical, more common, like the thermometer you use at home.
So the secondary ones depend on the accuracy of the primary one.
Yeah, exactly. A chain of trust, you could say. And what's really amazing is the variety of secondary thermometers out there, using all sorts of principles, light, sound, even electricity.
Wow, that's impressive. It's like they took every part of physics and said, can we measure temperature with this?
Pretty much. It's a really fascinating field, always pushing to find new and better ways to measure temperature for specific needs.
So what are some of the most interesting ways we measure temperature today?
Well, take infrared thermometers. Those are pretty common now. You know, the ones they use at the doctor's office. Those use invisible infrared radiation to measure temperature without even touching.
Yeah, it's like a little heat vision camera. How do those even work?
Basically, all objects give off infrared radiation. The hotter something is, the more radiation it gives off. The thermometer picks up that radiation and turns it into a temperature reading.
That's pretty cool. From simple air expansion to invisible radiation, thermometers have come a long way.
They really have, and that's just one example. There are tons of other methods out there, each one with its own special uses and benefits.
This has definitely changed how I see thermometers. But before we go any further, I think it's time to shift gears and look at how thermometers are actually used in the real world. It really is amazing when you think about it. Measuring temperature affects so many parts of our lives. It's not just checking the weather or seeing if we have a fever.
Oh, yeah. I mean, take food, for example. Thermometers are essential for food safety. Think about restaurants and grocery stores. They need to make sure food is stored at the right temperature, or even cooking. You want that steak cooked just right.
Right? Never really thought about it that way. Temperature is super important when it comes to food.
Absolutely. And what about medicine? We use thermometers all the time to diagnose fevers and things like that. They're also crucial during surgery to monitor patients, even for tracking how well certain treatments are working.
It's like they're working behind the scenes to keep us healthy. Always on the lookout. And speaking of things that are always on the lookout, what about meteorology? They must use thermometers all the time.
For sure. Weather stations all over the world use thermometers to measure air and water temperatures. It's how we understand weather patterns and predict what's coming next, and of course, for studying climate change.
It's fascinating how something so basic, like measuring temperature, can have such a huge impact on so many different things.
It really speaks to the power of human curiosity. We want to understand the world around us, and that starts with being able to measure it. And even with all the progress we've made, we're still finding new and better ways to measure temperature.
So what's next for thermometers? Any exciting new developments on the horizon?
Well, one area that's really interesting is nanoscale thermometers. These are thermometers that are so small they can measure the temperature of individual cells.
Wow, that's incredible. Measuring temperature on such a tiny scale, what could we even use that for?
Oh, all sorts of things. It could revolutionize medical research and treatment. And there's also work being done to create even more accurate and sensitive thermometers for things like astrophysics, quantum computing, you name it.
It's amazing to think about how far we've come, from those early experiments with air expansion to measuring the temperature of individual cells.
It's been quite a journey. And it's not over yet. Every new discovery just leads to more questions and more possibilities.
Well said. It just goes to show that even the simplest things can be incredibly complex and fascinating, and that there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. Don't underestimate the power of a good question.
A huge thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the world of thermometers. We hope you learned something new and that you'll tune in again next time for more fascinating stories here on Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast.